No, these tanks are good tanks. They're survivable tanks. They're designed to do this, but they are losing a lot more tanks than this is why they had to stop reselling their old Merkava 3 tanks that they were going to sell to Morocco and others. They had to keep them because they have to organize new reserve armored battalions to make up for the losses that they're suffering in Gaza. But now this fight's turned into an infantry fight, and the Israeli infantry just isn't up to the task. I'm not, I'm an old fat man thousands of miles away from the battlefield, so I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I could do it any better than the Israelis. When I was younger, I could do it a hell of a lot better, and so could my Marines. These guys aren't very good. Russian people Russian commanders who fought in Mariupol, fought in Bakhmut, are looking at the Israeli tactics that they're using, and they're saying if they took this up against a real army, they'd all be dead. But they're not fighting they're fighting Hamas. It's a different kind of fight, but these aren't very good soldiers. They're not, they don't have the discipline. They can't. How can you be, let's just put it this way. If you're a 23-year-old major, you ain't very good.
You're right.
Okay. Major should be around, 32, 35, so that's a whole nother decade of experience you need to have before you're a major. If you're a 19-year-old sergeant, you ain't very good at all.
When I was I'll say this, in law enforcement, when I became captain, I was 36. And I was the youngest captain in the state of Maryland. Of all of the, various police departments that the state has, I was the youngest one. I got major at 38. And that was fairly young. Right? Because it takes a lot of years just to know, for one thing, all the policies and procedures. What happens if this happens? You can't hold on, let me go get the manual. You have to know, if this happens, notify this person, do this, call this person. People are going to look at you. This happened. What do we do? You have to know that stuff, rote memory, right? You ain't going to learn that in a couple years. So even in law enforcement, you're not going to find a bunch of captains and majors running around even in their late 20s. Usually it's their late 30s. The guys are going to have some gray starting to show up here before you start seeing those oak leaves and train tracks start to show up on their collar, right? So you can call somebody a major, but when you just stick them out there, and of course, in the rubble, let's be honest, if we're fighting in the rubble and I'm Hamas, I'm looking for oak leaves and stripes. I'm looking for the guy in that kind of environment. I'm looking for the people with rank to shoot first.
Well, you know why they have majors that are 23 years old? Because, look, I got promoted to captain when I was 28 years old. Okay, one thing I learned to become a captain is that the answer is staff sergeant. First thing, hey, Cap, what about this? Good question. Staff sergeant, hey, Gunny, come here. What's the answer to that question? Because I'm just 28. I may have captain rank, but I don't know. I mean, I was honest enough to say, I don't know. Gunny, staff sergeant, sergeant, corporal, lance corporal, somebody come and help me, please, because I don't know the answer. But that's okay, because I had experienced Marines who would then come in and say, hey, Captain, this is what we think that. And then I would sit there and think about it and come up with an answer. But what's happening with these Israelis, they don't have that. They don't have gunnery. They don't have 15-year gunnery sergeants. They don't have 10-year staff sergeants. They got 19-year-old sergeants. So what that means is the tasks that would be assigned to these experienced NCOs in the American system have to be assumed by officers. So they have majors, 23-year-old majors, doing the work of a staff sergeant. It's a totally screwed up system. They're officers. They're saying this is the leadership ethic of the Israelis. No, it ain't. It's called stupidity. It's called a conscript army. It's called what happens when you don't have a professional army. And just keep in mind that the vast majority of these Israelis out there fighting are young kids with no military experience. These aren't guys that have been in the military for 10 years, 15 years, who've been there, done it, got a couple T-shirts. These are guys, this is their first experience, and they're not trained well. They didn't go. I saw a comment in there about a guy saying, I lived at, I was stationed at Fort Hood, but I lived at 29 Palms, or he lived at Fort Ord. He talked about Reforger. the reinforcement of forces in Germany. That's an exercise that we did during the Cold War, where we would literally every year or sometimes twice a year fly 10,000 soldiers out to join up with pre-positioned equipment, and within less than 12 hours of landing, they were in the field with their equipment going through combat drills, because that's the way we had to fight with the Soviets coming across the border. You had to land, jump in, and go. Be ready to fight now. And the only way you could do that is by training 24/7. You didn't even become good at Reforger. I would ask this guy to ask me that. Were you good the first time you did Reforger? No. Why? Because it was all new. You're going, Christ, this is difficult. I don't understand what's going on. You only became good at Reforger about the fourth time you did it, when you went, okay, I know what to expect. I can anticipate. My brain's not going to get bogged down. I can boom. And suddenly things are working the way they're supposed to work. That was the whole purpose of it. But 4 Reforgers meant that you were in for 2, 3, 4 years before you became good at it. Israeli conscripts in for 2.5 years. Half of that time spent just getting basic training. They aren't good at anything. They're not good at anything. And I'm just saying that with all seriousness. They suck. They're good at beating up girls, beating up 10-year-old boys, breaking arms, shooting old men, but they're not good at war. They're not good at it all. You can't even be good at tank operator. Think about that. Who's driving the damn Merkava tanks? Guys have been driving for 10 years? No, guys that got straight out of armor school, and now they're in a Merkava tank in one of the most demanding environments in the world. They don't know how to use cover. They don't know anything about what they're doing. They're coming in there scared. Bam, they get hit. Now what do? Where's their infantry support? Did they practice that tactic? Half the people out there that have worked with the American tank infantry team knows what happens the first time you go out there and you try to work with the Bradley and dismounted guys. You screw it up badly. You lose every time. Why? Because the enemy's going to kick your ass because you don't know what you're doing. But then you take that loss, you come back and you talk about it, and you say, okay, hey, rather than you guys deploying here and getting overextended and me coming in without you here, okay, we're going to come in. Get that guy deployed first. Okay, you got that field of fire. Come in here, boom. Okay, get the fire suppression down. Okay, now move in. Now do this. Now you're thinking tactically. It takes a long time to do that. These Israelis don't think tactically. Plus, they're emotion driven. When your strategic purpose is to inflict pain on the Palestinians, that's what you're doing. These Israelis are more intent on making TikTok videos showing them desecrating mosques, burning schools, embarrassing, humiliating Palestinian women than they are focused on the actual business of war. If you're not, I was told, I'll just leave this. I had a Marine captain once drive me from, I took a ride from Washington, D.C. back to Quantico. As we're driving there, we're talking, and he's like, you're going to be a career Marine. I'm like, yeah, it looks like it. And he's like, okay, hey, what do you see out here? And I'm driving through in this beautiful land of Northern Virginia. And I went, I don't know, some hills, some town. He goes, you ain't a professional warrior yet. He goes, when you look at that, I want you to see, the best route up the hill, where the covering fire position is. I want you to be looking at, cover, concealment. You have to be thinking this every time you go. We told that same thing with firefighters. I was drive through with my firefighters in town. I'd say, what do you see? Oh, street. And I said, no. You have to see single wall construction. You have to see this. You have to look in there and see the car. Are there children's toys out in the front yard? So if you show up, are there going to be kids in that house? Is there evidence of animals? You got to look at this kind of stuff. When you got to think firefighting. Where's the fire hydrant? What's my best approach so I don't block the ladder coming in? Where are the lines? If you're not thinking like that, you're not a professional. As a Marine, I literally, to this day, I look at everything from a perspective of tactical advantage, operational, logistical sustainability, because I was trained that way. These Israelis, they don't think like that. They don't think like that at all. They're not very good at what they do. And Hamas lured them into a trap of their own making, and Hamas is kicking the living snot out of them.
If you got a couple minutes, you got enough for one more subject? Maybe we'll
yeah.
10 minutes. Okay. Let me share two things with you. Let's look at it. Number one, I'm going to do two. Here's the first one. Break-in. Marianne Williamson claims primaries are rigged, accuses 4 states of bias towards Joe Biden. So what we got is Florida, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Massachusetts Only Biden's name will appear on the ballot. They will not allow anyone. The Democratic Party has decided those 4 states are Joe Biden's. If Garland Nixon, if Scott Ritter, if somebody who's lived in that state the entire life, if they're beloved by everyone and they say, you know what, I think I want to give it a shot. Sorry, Joe Biden's the only person. It's like we hear about those banana republics. Hey, vote for whoever, and they put one name on the ballot. Now, let's do one other. One more article. All right. Republicans threatened to take Joe Biden off the ballot in states they control, right? And why are they doing that? Because of a Colorado ruling that Donald Trump is not permitted to be on the ballot this year. So what we got is a Democratic Party where Biden, let's face it, he's done. We watched him the other day say that 65 years ago, on October 7th, 65 years ago, he said this. I saw the video that Hamas attacked Israel. His father, he literally said, my father went back to the kibbutz to look for his family. His Irish Catholic father, who died 20 years ago, apparently was living in a kibbutz. 65 years / days. It was madness. And the Democratic Party has said, in our primaries, you can only vote for this guy. Meanwhile, as far as the Republicans are concerned, Donald Trump, like him, don't like him, it doesn't matter. He has every right. You and I have every right to run. Everybody has every right to run. I'm sorry, if you're a person that wants to vote for Donald Trump, nah, that ain't happening. He ain't on the ballot. To call this a miscarriage of justice is absurd. But it's like I said now, Republicans are saying, and as soon as that happened, I said that we'll take Joe Biden off the ballot in states where they control, which I disagree with all of it, but I predicted that would happen. We now have a Democratic Party that has become, I don't even know what the word for this is, fascism, to say we're going to take people off the ballots, where our own constituents, they can't vote. You want to talk about a banana republic fascist activity? This is about as bad as I've ever seen it. What are your thoughts on this, Scott Ritter?
No, I mean, ladies and gentlemen, it's over for America. We've become a joke, a tragic joke. Democracy is dead. I mean, it works at the local level to an extent, but again, who puts the names on the ballot? Ask yourselves that. I mean, when you go to the poll on election day and you go, okay, here's the name, who put them there? Did you? Or did the Democratic Party pick somebody? Or did the Republic? See, we become so accustomed to, transferring the responsibilities of citizenship to entities that are unelected, and they get to select for us. So when we go to elect, we're going through the process of thinking we're voting and therefore being a good citizen and we have control, but we're just voting for a preordained outcome, one or the other, picked by somebody else that we have no. We're dead as a society. We are done. I believe in the Constitution, and I believe in constitutional processes. And it's illegal to advocate for violent overthrow of the Constitution. It's illegal to do that. But when the Constitution no longer works, when it's become a fraud, when it's become a joke, maybe Thomas Jefferson had it right. I'm not going to repeat his words because I don't want people to get in trouble. You guys can look them up. You know what I'm talking about. The Tree of Liberty. We're headed in the wrong direction. And I don't know what it takes to get the American people to wake up, because it's not just about getting Joe Biden out of office. It's not just about putting Donald Trump or keeping Donald Trump out of office, whatever you want. It's about the system. The system is corrupt. The system is broken. The system is the one that fools us into thinking that this is a democratic institution. We are a joke, literal joke. We go around and we interfere in the electoral processes of other nations and say, well, you don't run elections right. We don't run elections right. Man, there is no singular. We have 50 states to do 50 different things with different ways, and within the states, different things. We don't know how to run an election. Why is it that Iran can tell you the same day who won the election with a very accurate vote count. Why can Iran count votes better than we can? Why can't we count votes? What is it about the American system that has it so that on the day of a national election, we have to wait a week until we find out what vote counted? Guys, it's broken. The system's broken. And it leads to, I'm not going to jump here and jump on the bandwagon of a stolen election. All right. I'm not saying, what I'm saying though is it leads to the perception of a problem. If at the end of the night, you don't know what's going on and then things start happening. Now, people tell you that that's not nefarious and all that, but things start happening, then vote counts start changing. That may be just the process of counting votes. I accept that, but it doesn't look right. It doesn't smell right. And it creates the perception of fraud. And the perception of fraud is more destructive to democracy than real fraud, or as destructive, because people start to lose faith in the system. And then this leads to people accepting at face value. I mean, this is revolution generating stuff. You can only have one name on the ballot. Since when did we allow that as Americans? This is where the Minutemen go in the street and say, hell no, we're changing that. But, Bernie Sanders should have done this back when Hillary Clinton had him kicked off, when he won the damn Democratic primary, but the Democratic National Committee stole it from him to install the Queen. He should have stormed the stage and taken over that process and said, you're all fired. I'm in charge now. My people have spoken. It's democratic process. We got more supporters for me than you do for her. I'm the nominee. The Democratic National Committee is fired. The people have now taken over. Wow. That would have been a revolution. That would have been cool. At some point in time, we have to stop playing sheep, literally. The thing about sheep is, and I've said this before, but I'll say it again. You're out there, man, you got a dog. He makes you feel good because he keeps you moving in the right direction. Dog's my friend. And then you got the shepherd out there and you look at the shepherd. The shepherd's protecting me because the shepherd feeds the dog protects me. And they keep moving me in this direction. I'm happy. And then the shepherd stops. The dog puts me into a pen. Then they open up a pen and I get pushed in. Shepherd, until I'm slaughtered. That's what we are. We are sheep being led to the slaughter, believing the dog and the shepherd are our friends. They're not. They're just going to kill us. That's the reality of American politics today. We have to be our own shepherd. We have to be our own dog. We've allowed these institutions to be captured by unelected powers, people who operate outside of the control.
Minimal level of military training, and even the training they got was never used to full effect. Then they left the military. There's been no follow-on training. Now they're called back up and they're being asked to go into the most difficult kind of warfare imaginable, urban warfare. And not just in a city, but a city that's been destroyed. Anybody who knows anything about urban warfare, you can track it from Stalingrad, through Monte Cassino to Bakhmut and Mariupol. When our experience in Mosul, when you blow up a city, you've made the job of defending the city that much easier, and you've made the job of attacking that much more difficult. And also keep in mind this, Hamas carried out a flawless attack on October 7th. It was professionally planned and executed. They didn't do that without having an end game, meaning that everything they did, from destroying the Israeli military capacity to kidnapping people and bringing them back into Gaza, was designed to enrage Israel so that Israel stops thinking rationally, and lure Israel into Gaza, knowing that the Israeli Air Force would bomb. Every bomb that hits Gaza is not killing Hamas. It's killing innocent Palestinians. Hamas is well below ground, not being impacted by these bombs because they thought about it beforehand. They know the weapon. They know what its effects are on the ground, and they've brought that in. The Israeli army right now is scared to death. These reservists don't have the training. They're scared to death. If they go in, they will be slaughtered. If they go in also, it's likely they will trigger a larger regional conflict. Hezbollah in the north has said they don't want to get involved in this, but if Israel keeps slaughtering the Palestinian people, which they have, over 6,500 dead, over 1,000 of them are children, have been killed by the Israeli indiscriminate bombing, Hezbollah said they will intervene. And let's keep in mind, Hezbollah, until Hamas's victory on October 7th, Hezbollah was the only Arab force that actually beat the Israelis in a stand-up fight.
So, Scott, I have a question. I mean, I think the attack from Hamas is a brutal attack, against innocent Israelis. And I think what we've seen is a huge outcry from, certainly the Western world, the United States and our allies, everyone standing very clearly with Israel. I mean, would you agree with this? Is that the rise of Hamas, I mean, they were democratically elected in 2006. Do you think that the reason for them being elected is simply the fact that these Palestinians felt no other option was left for them, the fact that they just didn't have a future, and so that they would resort to something of this extremism? I mean, I'm certainly under the belief that Hamas is definitely closer to a terrorist organization than a legitimate, freedom fighter. But I mean, certainly carrying out those attacks. But I can also understand that probably the conditions that Israel created for Palestine is the exact breeding grounds for an organization like Hamas to be democratically elected and to go carry out those attacks.
So I am not going to accept the idea that Hamas on October 7th was a terrorist organization. They were carrying out a military assault, and they carried out with far more precision and far less collateral damage than what Israel's doing. If you're going to call Hamas a terrorist organization, then every single Israeli pilot that flies over Gaza today and indiscriminately drops bombs that have killed 6,500 Palestinian civilians, over 1,000 who are children, then they are terrorists. And if they're terrorists, everybody who wears the green of the IDF is a terrorist, and every Israeli politician is a terrorist. And I think it's more accurate to call Israel the terrorist entity in this case than it is to say Hamas. The history of Hamas and the formation of Hamas is complex. They come from a Muslim extremist foundation. The Muslim Brotherhood is their ideological base. Unlike the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which is more secular in nature, Hamas is definitely very much fundamentalist in terms of their religious beliefs. The Israelis have been fostering Hamas from the very beginning. I mean, Hamas, was conceived by the Palestinians as its own thing, but it was the Israeli government that said, hey, this we can use. You see, Israel didn't want the Palestinian Liberation Army, or PLO, to become this powerful entity, because the last thing Israel wants is a viable Palestinian state. I'll say that one more time, just so people understand what I'm saying. Israel does not want a Palestinian state, never has, won't tolerate it. They've talked about it, but they knew they were never going to allow it to happen. And one of the ways they prevented it from happening was to create a division within Palestinian population. So they promoted Hamas. They funneled money into Hamas. They openly collaborated with Hamas, even though I don't think Hamas understood they were being collaborated with, and they empowered Hamas. All the terrorist acts that took place in the 1990s took place because Israel wanted them to take place. I'm not saying they planned them. What I am saying is that Israel viewed that as a very effective way of not only dividing the Palestinian population, but then demonizing them in the eyes of the world so that there wouldn't be a Palestinian state. You see, if Hamas is around blowing up buses and bridges, no one's going to support a Palestinian state, because everybody has bought into the notion that Israeli security must come first. Israel was facilitating the acts of terror that took place against them by creating the organization that produced the terrorists. That doesn't mean that Israel wasn't hunting them down and killing them. Of course they were. I'm just saying that Israel is not an innocent party here. Benjamin Netanyahu is not an innocent party. In 2005, they made a decision to transition from a terrorist organization. Israel made the decision to transition Hamas from a terrorist organization into a political organization. They coordinated with the Qatari government to pour in millions of dollars to turn Hamas into a political party. And then they helped facilitate them in elections that Hamas won, by the way. Hamas won the majority of seats in the Palestinian parliament. And then what happened is Israel, I think, was a little taken aback. They wanted a little party. They didn't want a big party. So they then facilitated a civil war between Fatah, the military wing of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and Hamas. Hamas had a significant representation in the West Bank, a very strong representation in Gaza. When the civil war ended, Fatah had been totally eliminated in Gaza, and Hamas had been kicked out of the West Bank. So Gaza became a Hamas stronghold. And from 2007 onwards, Hamas has run the show. There are other resistance groups. The Palestinian Islamic Jihad is one that's well known, but the biggest and the most influential is Hamas, and they're running the show there. Now, they have a job of governance, and they are doing that, but they've never forgotten their resistance roots. I, again, ask everybody just to reflect on the reality that Gaza is an open-air concentration camp. If you lived in an open-air concentration camp, tell me what you would do. And if you say I would sit there and do nothing, you're a liar. Every single man worthy of the name would wake up every morning saying, how do I hurt them? Hurt the occupiers, hurt the people that have pinned me in. And they would be very receptive to the message of resistance that comes from Hamas. So You know, now we come back to things that Joe Biden has said. The only solution to this problem, the only solution is the creation of a Palestinian state. If you want to defeat Hamas, and the only way you're going to defeat Hamas, you have to create a Palestinian state that diffuses Hamas's reason to exist. Hamas exists to resist Israel.
Right.
But if there is a Palestinian state, there's really nothing left to resist. And so Hamas will go away.
Right. I think I was reading a very good New York Times article where one of the comments on that article was that Hamas really represents an ideology more than it does a group of people, right? And I guess you're basically concluding that same
and
thing.
How do you kill an ideology?
Right. You replace it with what they want or with something that's better than that.
But how do you not kill an ideology?
Well, then you continue
dropping bombs, killing people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, I think that is well documented as well, that Israel this has certainly backfired on Israel's plan then, right? Because like you just mentioned, it has been well documented that Israel actually has supported Hamas over the years, mainly to create that division. So for those of you that aren't clear, Hamas does have the stronghold in Gaza, but there are many Palestinians in Gaza and, more on the West Bank that oppose Hamas. So it is, creating this internal division, right? It's not a united Palestinian front. So it was really a move from Israel and certainly Netanyahu to support Hamas in the sense of now you've broken up the support in Palestine. It's not a united front. Therefore, they won't be moving towards statehood. And that has seemed to now backfire, obviously, because of these attacks that were carried out on October 7th. Scott, I've got an interesting thing I want to shift to because there is a new article that was just written in the Financial Times. I'm going to bring it up here, is that fears grow that Israel has no plan agreed for a post-war Gaza. And when we read this article, it says the lack of an exit plan is one factor in the delays to the Gaza ground operation that has been long threatened by Benjamin Netanyahu's government. There is no plan for the day after. And this is the quote from the article that really stands out, as the Americans went crazy when they realized there was no plan. So I want to talk to you about this specifically because, initially, I think it was on October 9th or 10th, maybe, a couple days after, Netanyahu sent out a very clear message. He said, northern Gaza, 1.1 million people, you have 24 hours to evacuate, move into southern Gaza, we're coming in. Obviously, at the time, that was an impossible request, right? There's no way they could move 1 million people in less than 24 hours. And there was a huge concern, right, that all of a sudden, potentially 1 million people are going to get caught in these crossfires. It's now been almost 2 weeks. We haven't seen Israel, make this move yet. And I think now we're starting to see a little bit of pushback from the Americans saying, what is the eventual plan here? Are you going to move forward with this? So I want to kind of get your thoughts on this as far as, does the ground invasion happen? If they are to be moved from northern Gaza for this ground invasion, this is the innocent civilians we're talking about, where do they go? There's only one place that kind of makes sense, I guess, at least from the Israeli side. They're saying they could potentially go to the Sinai Peninsula, which is basically just a vast open desert. So I want to get your thoughts on this next phase here and what's now happening as Israel potential ground invasion is just a few days away, and what's really going to happen next.
Well, first of all, I just want to set the stage. Everything we're talking about is a war crime. Let's just be straight up honest about this. The concept of demanding that 1 million people leave their homes and move is a war crime. It's collective punishment. It's against the law. So anybody who sits there and says, we should consider, you're no better than the Nazis. You're no better than any war criminal that's ever existed. The fact that Israel is allowed to articulate this policy and not be held to account is stunning. The concept of collective punishment, which Israel has codified as official doctrine since 2006, is called the Dahawa doctrine, mowing the grass, is a war crime, a literal war crime. It's collective punishment. But nobody's saying anything. Everybody's just sitting there going, well, it's Israel, it's the Palestinians, it's normal. I guess it's normal for Israel to commit war crimes against Palestinians because they do on a daily basis. Everything Israel is doing in this conflict is a war crime. So right off the bat, we can't legitimize a war crime by saying, well, those 1 million people got to move. No, they don't. Those 1 million people can't move, and they're not going to move. No one's going to open up the gates. They're not going to the Sinai. The tragic reality is those 1 million people will die before they move. And now the question is, how much death will the world tolerate before they step in and tell Israel, enough is enough, you're done? Israel will not launch a ground incursion, a large-scale ground incursion into Gaza. They can't do it. There's American military teams right now telling them, you can't. Again, the question is, it's not just a political end game, it's a military end game. You go into Gaza and then what? They don't have a plan. Remember, Israel was taken by surprise on October 7th. So everything that's happening right now is basically a plan they're making up on the spot.
Right.
They're making it up. They've done two major military exercises recently. One, Chariots of Fire last year, this year, Firm Hand. All of them were what we call stress tests. They were stress testing the entire Israeli military establishment, premised on the notion that everything went bad at once, meaning Gaza, Hamas, West Bank, Palestinian Liberation Organization, Hezbollah, Syria, and Iran. First of all, each time Israel was swamped, they couldn't handle it. But the other thing about the stress test is they never considered this. Under no circumstances in these stress tests did they ever say, okay, part of the Israeli response will be to mobilize 300,000 Israeli reserves and send them to Gaza. Right. The reserves were mobilized and sent to Lebanon to fight Hezbollah. Gaza and the West Bank were considered to be police actions against militants, against terrorists, but not an outright war. So whatever war plan Israel had has been shredded, thrown away, and they're making it up as they go along, which means they don't have a clue what they're doing. And that's what's driving the Americans crazy, because Israel's saying we're going to go into Gaza, and America's saying, wait, what's your plan?
Right.
What are you going to do, Israel, now that you locked in 300,000 troops to Gaza when Hezbollah comes across the border up north? Right. Because in your real war plan, which we coordinated with you, you had most of your forces up there. And I tend to believe in the war game, you lost, because Hezbollah has all these missiles. They swamped your air defense. They blew up your cities. They blew up your military bases, and they seized northern Israel. So now you won't have any forces up there. And if you take a look at what's happening right now, the Israeli armor units up there, they're almost in revolt because Hezbollah is picking their tanks off one by one by one. I think it's 22 Merkava tanks have been blown up so far. And when I say blown up, that means dead crew members. Hezbollah is suffering casualties too. Israel's responding back. But my point is, this is not an invincible Israeli army. Right. This is an army that Hezbollah has been studying the fight for, continuously since 2006 when they last beat Israel. Israel's army today is an army of soft people who join. They don't train hard. I mean, you're getting reservist generals coming in saying they don't know how to clean their weapons. They're not motivated. These guys would give them equipment. They don't wear it right. They're not in physical condition. I was talking to a Russian colonel who was talking about urban warfare, the Russian lessons from Mariupol and Bakhmut. He said, the first thing is you have to be extraordinarily fit to do this.
Right.
Because you're wearing around 50, 60 pounds worth of combat kit.
Right.
And if you're not wearing it, you're going to die.
Right.
Because you're going to get hit in the head. You're going to get hit in the chest. You're going to get hit in the groin, in the back. And if you're not wearing this gear, you're dead. This way, you might get knocked down. You might get wounded, but at least you'll be alive. But you got to wear the gear. He said, in running across, because you don't walk, running from point A to point B, constantly getting up, getting down. He says, if you're not training for this, you're in trouble. He said, we had to take our units and go out. In addition to training on tactics, we had to get them physically fit. They had to be used to wearing this stuff. The reservists right now, these are fat donut-eating boys and girls. They're not well fit. They're going to exhaust themselves. They're going to go across into Gaza, and they're going to drop like flies, not from Hamas fire, but just from heat exhaustion and the fact that they can't carry the weight. They're not conditioned to do it. They don't have the proper tactics. Again, the guy was saying, we had to learn that you don't use SWAT tactics, because everybody plays Call of Duty and every play, watches the movies. And of course, all the commandos get together at the door, and then they shotgun in and they shoot the thing up. And he says, you do that, a drone comes in, drops a mortar on you, kills everybody. Right. In modern war, you're dispersed, and you have to train to do that. It's a whole new mindset of dispersal, et cetera. Israel hasn't trained to do this. So
Scott, do you think that? Do you predict that Israel will not go in with this ground invasion? Do you think that
Israel can't go in with this ground invasion? There's two reasons why. One, they're going to lose. And the Americans are telling them straight up, you're going to lose. What Israel will do is have small incursions. You'll see raids going in. Okay. But the idea of 100,000 Israeli troops lining up their tanks and going in, that isn't going to happen. Yeah. And one of the main reasons why it's not going to happen is America's saying, what do you do when Hezbollah comes across the border? Right. What's your plan?
Right, because you're spread too thin, right? You've got all the
not only that, but Hamas just wiped out Iron Dome. Iron Dome, they've shot all their ammunition. There's no ammunition left. They're begging America for more. We gave them the last 360 odd rounds we have. We've got nothing left. We're trying to produce it, but you can't produce it overnight. And there's 200,000 rockets in Hezbollah's arsenal. 200,000. Let's say Israel has 3,000 interceptors left. Hezbollah simply fires 3,000 rockets. Israel expends everything. Now they have 197,000 more that'll come in and hit Israel without any defense. Nothing.
So, Scott, you've brought up a good point here, and is that a bigger threat to the north, Hezbollah? And I want to shift our strategy here and our conversation more towards Iran now, because I think there is a lot of speculation that the potential is for a bigger conflict here in the region to really erupt. And I think this is why the United States obviously immediately sent over military aircraft carriers. I mean, we've got a huge military envoy going over there right now, already there, and I think this is a very sensitive situation. Obviously, when we look at the Russia-Ukraine situation, Ukraine we can say is an ally, but certainly nowhere like Israel. I mean, we would never put boots on the ground in Ukraine for any matter. But I think if push comes to shove, we would certainly see American troops on the ground, or we would see America rushing to do whatever it needs to do to stabilize that region. What do you feel is the biggest threat right now? I mean, do you feel that there is a big potential for a conflict between the U.S. and Iran, and what is your thoughts on the grander picture if this does not stay contained and it really erupts into a larger regional conflict? What does that look like to you?
Well, let me just start by pointing out that I think the greatest threat to Israel is actually from Hamas, not from Hezbollah, because it's Hamas that has brought the issue of a Palestinian state to the forefront. And that's the biggest threat to Israel's vision of a greater Israel. It undoes decades of Israeli policy. So that's the greatest threat. Let's talk about Hezbollah real brief. Hezbollah doesn't want to fight Israel. They don't want to. Hezbollah is focused on governing in Lebanon. They're a political party in addition to having this very strong militia. But their goal right now, Lebanon is a nation that's devastated by a collapsing economy, and Hezbollah is part of the government trying to build a functioning coalition. The last thing they need is a war with Israel, where Israeli bombs level West Beirut as they did in 2006. So Hezbollah is not itching for a fight. This is why Hezbollah has said, as long as what Israel doesn't cross the line of tolerance, we'll stay out of this fight. And Hamas has told everybody, we got this under control, guys. We don't need you. We got this under control. And they do. They're in total control of the situation. It's callously, they don't care about the people upstairs, or they do, but they're like Charles de Gaulle, they're willing to sacrifice them for the greater good. If you asked the majority of Palestinians, if you could die, give your life for the birth of a Palestinian nation, they would say yes, because for 75 years, that's all they dreamed of. And now, thanks to Hamas, they have that possibility. Hezbollah does not want to be a part of the fight. Iran does not want to be a part of this fight. Again, Iran has met with the Hamas political leadership in Qatar, and we're told the same thing. We don't want you to intervene. We got this under control. What's that tell you? When the Israelis say, we know that Iran gave the green light. Iran knew nothing about this. This took Iran totally by surprise, just like Hezbollah was taken by surprise. And Iran is saying, hey, guys, we just normalized relations with Saudi Arabia. Big deal. I mean, that's a huge deal.
Which, by the way, was negotiated by China.
By China.
Yeah.
We are now joining BRICS.
Right.
We're a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Our focus is economic. We are focusing on getting the economy of Iran, which has been suffering under sanctions for decades, on its feet, moving forward. The last thing Iran needs is a war, and they don't want a war. They want to avoid a war. And they have communicated this to the United States, which is another reason why the United States is telling Israel, you're not going into Gaza, guys, because nobody wants this war. You're going to lose the war. You can't win. And if you go in, you risk turning this into a regional war that nobody wants. Now, we know, if you've read Barbara Tuchman's book, The Guns of August, we know that in World War I, in the summer of 1914, nobody wanted a world war, but everybody slow walked their way to it because it was just one of these things, like a slow-moving traffic accident that is going to be horrible, and you're watching it, and you're not doing anything to stop because it's inevitable. We could be on that path. Hopefully, we're not. Hopefully, the United States has communicated appropriately, not only with Israel, but with Hezbollah and with Iran, that we want to avoid escalation. This is why, if you noticed last night, there was a massive attack against American bases in Syria and Iraq by so-called Shia resistance forces. 24 Americans, according to the news, were wounded, soldiers. One contractor died of a heart attack. Now, normally, this would be the kind of thing that would precipitate massive American counterstrike. But have you seen American bombers in the air dropping bombs? No. Why? Because this is called escalation management. Right. This is where we are going to absorb a certain amount of punishment as sort of like a safety valve. You want to bleed off this pressure, bleed it off. But what you have to ensure when you bleed off the pressure, that you're not doing anything to generate more pressure. Again, let me just make this point. For the first time in a long time, there is a chance for real peace in the Middle East, because you could never talk about genuine peace in the Middle East if it didn't include a legitimate Palestinian state. Thanks to Hamas, thanks to what Hamas did, that option is now on the table, and there's recognition by everybody that there will be no going forward, no return to the status quo without a Palestinian state being created. This is bad news for Israel, but it's good news for Israel. Israel wants security. There will never be security without a Palestinian state, because there will always be conflict.
Right.
There will always be a war. Israel somehow believes that they can make this problem go away. They haven't. The only way this problem goes away is what we talked about earlier. You create a legitimate Palestinian state. You allow the Palestinian people now to have hope based upon their own hard work to create their own nation. And you instantly delegitimized the kind of violence that Hamas is promoting. You will compel Hamas to become a political entity dedicated to the growth and prosperity of a Palestinian state, or else they will be thrust into the trash bin of history by the Palestinian people, because they have no legitimate reason to continue.
Right.
So there's now, for the first time in a long time, legitimate hope for peace in the Middle East.
Do you think that, now I would imagine that Israel, the last thing on their mind right now is establishing that legitimate state of Palestine. I mean, do you think that this is going to have to take something from like a President Biden really meeting with Netanyahu and trying to convince him? I mean, it feels that the United States is really the only country in the world that could have any type of leverage or can really talk to Israel right now. I think we're the only country that really has any chance to sit down and communicate. I know that the situation is difficult because Netanyahu is a very far-right extreme politician, and he has surrounded himself with a cabinet that is even more extreme than he is. There's also, he's wanted on corruption charges. His hands are kind of tied as well because he can't do a lot of things. And I think his cabinet basically is saying, we want this revenge. And now I would almost kind of argue this point a little bit, that is this not throwing the chance for statehood even further down the line? I mean, wouldn't Israel be fighting, desperately to avoid that? Or is this really their only option? Is it, like you said, if they want security, they're going to have to establish the statehood?
Israel doesn't have a vote anymore. They got beat. Let me just make it clear.
Yeah.
When you win, you get a vote. When you're the victor, you get to dictate. But when you've been defeated, you have to listen. You have to accept. Benjamin Netanyahu is a man who, even before this October 7th attack, was on thin ice politically. In order to stay in power, because as you pointed out, he's been charged with very serious corruption charges. And again, you're innocent until proven guilty. But I mean, sometimes it's very obvious that you're guilty, and he's guilty of corruption charges that will put him in jail for a very long time. Not just him, but his wife. But what he's done with his Likud allies is he was reelected. He's created a governing coalition, but he had to go far right to do it. In Israel, they don't have a constitution, but they have the basic law, which replicates that notion. And what Netanyahu has done, together with his far right allies in the Knesset, is they've rewritten the basic law of Israel so that the judiciary is now subordinate to the Knesset and the prime minister. So any judge that moves forward with a case against Netanyahu for corruption can be impeached. They'll just impeach him. Bam, gone. I mean, this is the kind of stuff of banana republics. This is why hundreds of thousands of Israelis took to the streets before October 7th. They were saying, we're done. The president of Israel was saying, we are very close to a civil war. And he was saying, literally, we're very close to this nation breaking apart and going to war with itself. That was the situation that existed prior to October 7th. The one thing Netanyahu had going for him was that he had convinced people that he was the security guy, that he alone could secure Israel from Iran, from Hezbollah, from Hamas. He was the man. Right. Well, he failed. October 7th is a failure.
Right.
And so now... Yeah. So now when we talk about Israel's political future, understand this. At some point in time, the generals who failed, the politicians who failed, will have to shut up. Because right now they're sucking all the oxygen out, saying terrorists. They're making stuff up. I mean, look, we can go back to the beginning of World War I and look at atrocity propaganda. When the Germans marched into Belgium, they were literally accused of ripping babies out of the wombs, of beheading children, of doing raping, all this stuff. Hamas has been accused of the same thing. Every day, it's a standard thing. They beheaded children. They raped women. They did this. There's no evidence that they did any of that. It hasn't been presented. You might find a one example here or one example, but from a policy standpoint, in fact, there's overwhelming evidence that Hamas, being a very fundamentalist Islamic organization, they actually treat women with respect. Imagine that. All the women hostages have said they treated us with respect. They gave us medical care. Now, the people say, well, that's just propaganda, Scott. I don't know. But until you find a narrative that counters that, that's the one that we have documented, not by Hamas saying it, but by the hostages themselves, about the people that were held by Hamas. So the point I'm trying to get at is that at some point in time, the Netanyahu government is going to be held to account for what happened on October 7th, and the Israeli people will not forgive them. Everybody who died, when it becomes documented,